would like to introduce Dr. Carol with the Florida Panther Management Coordinator with the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. She is offered to give some background and some information on where the Florida Panther where it started, where has it come. At one time, it was down to about 30 panthers. Now the panther population has increased quite a bit. But where do we need to go? Where are we trying to go? What's the future of the panther? There's a lot of challenges out there. There's been a lot of successes, but to be truly successful, where are we going and how do we get there? So with that, I will turn it over to Carol.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. So like Grant said, I've been working on the Panther project for just about 5 months now. So I'm going to highlight some of the major conservation actions that have happened over the years, and then tell you what we're going to be focusing on in the future. Slow to advance. Okay, before we jump into the meat, we'll clarify what is a Florida Panther. So, everywhere else in the country, people call them cougars, mountain lions, catamounts, and panther is apparently, it was a word used here in the 1800s and it just stuck. We don't have mountains in Florida, so mountain lion doesn't really work. But it causes some confusion with the general public because they think that Florida Panther is something different than a cougar out west, but really it's just the same thing. The main difference, however, is that Florida Panthers are an endangered species. Up until 1950, there were no restrictions on the take of Florida panthers. In fact, the state offered bounties on panther scalps as a way to eliminate them from the landscape. However, it became apparent that numbers were dwindling, and so they were initially given protection as a game species so that they could only be hunted during a game season. Then in 1958, they were listed as endangered by the state. And then in 1967, they were federally listed. And then when the ESA was enacted in 1973, they were one of the first species added to the endangered species list. But there are 32 subspecies of the puma, and they range throughout North America, Central America, and South America. The key takeaway from this slide is that if you look at the historic range, now, can you see my mouse? Does that show up on the, no, it does, okay. So the historic range of the Florida Panther is throughout the Southeast United States, and it did abut with the range of the subspecies in Texas. So historically, there was interchange between Florida Panthers and Texas cougars. As any other federally endangered species, there is a recovery plan, and the recovery criteria for the species is to be downgraded from endangered to threatened. There need to be 2 populations of at least 240 animals. And to be removed altogether from the list, there need to be 3 populations of 240. And that is not just Florida, that's throughout the southeastern United States. So at the state level, our program began in 1981. And back then, the main priority was just really learning basic biology and ecology of the panthers. So little was known about them. A lot of people doubted that they were still around. They thought they were extinct. And throughout these initial studies, it really became clear that how few panthers there were and how inbred they were and the health problems that this led to. But I'll expand on that in a bit. As the research and management program has progressed, we're focusing on range expansion, continued health and disease issues. We're attempting to refine our population estimates, and doing things like, whenever a new type of GPS collar comes out, we want to test it, or anything to help us refine monitoring. We are lucky that we have the Florida Panther Research and Management Trust Fund, which is supported by the Panther license plate. It gives us a little bit of a buffer whenever there's fluctuations in the state budget due to economic downfalls. But the sales of the Panther plate have dropped in recent years, mostly because there's so much competition. There are so many specialty plates in Florida. And in I think the past couple of years, it's probably half of what it was 15 years ago. So we are currently working on a plate redesign, which will hopefully boost sales. Still, on average, $1 million of annual contribution goes into the trust fund. That isn't our budget each year. Our budget is appropriated by the legislature. But we still, if we can boost the trust fund, all the better. Okay, so the panthers that were here in the early 80s and 90s were highly inbred, as I mentioned. And so there was sort of a discussion amongst population experts, and the decision was made to embark on a genetic restoration project. And by doing this, they decided to bring in 8 female cougars from Texas. And these were released into Florida just to give a little bit of a genetic infusion. The goal, I think, was about a 20% intergrade. And the problem is that, people thought that we were going to be eliminating a true Florida Panther. Instead, we return them to the genetically healthy individuals that they should be. Some of the manifestations of inbreeding were an atrial septal defect, which is literally like a hole in the heart. This can occur in people as well. Males sometimes had 1 or no testicles. They would also have deformed sperm, and obviously this would lead to all sorts of reproductive issues. Twisted spleens were observed, and then what most people are aware of, the kink tails and the cowlicks in their fur. These 2 traits, the kink tail and the cowlick, people actually thought that was a defining characteristic of Florida Panther, what set them apart from other cougars. Instead, it was just a sign of how inbred they were. So the 8 females that were brought in from Texas were dispersed throughout the Panther's range upon their release. 4 to Big Cypress, 2 to Fakahatchee, and 2 to Everglades National Park. And it worked. It was a huge success. Those 8 females in the first year produced 20 kittens. And there were, future crosses of the F1 and F2 individuals. But in the very first litter, all of the bad traits disappeared. So this graph shows the minimum count of panthers. So that includes individual panthers, but also their signs. So if we saw evidence of tracks, scat, scratches, scrapes. So this shows the count of 20 to 30 individuals in the 80s to a current estimate of about 180 to 230 animals. This includes only subadults and adults south of the Caloosahatchee River. So this is part of the breeding population. And the 180 to 230 estimate comes from a combination of camera trap survey, roadkill data, and habitat availability. We're limited by the fact that most of our research occurs on public land. So it's difficult to extrapolate an estimate of density on public land to all of the private land that also hosts panthers, where the habitat may not necessarily support the same density. One thing that the team really didn't think through fully with this recovery was what happens when we start having panthers all over the place. So all of a sudden people were seeing panthers in their yards, they were encountering them on trails, and pet goats were disappearing. So it became apparent that some sort of plan was necessary in the unlikely event that a panther attacked somebody. And we didn't want to be caught off guard. And so they turned to other states and in some cases just flat out plagiarized the response. But the main difference that we can't just straight do what they do out west is because we're dealing with an endangered species. So we need to make sure that any actions that are taken here would not impact any ongoing conservation efforts. This is an interagency plan, so all of the managing agencies responsible for panther conservation are on the same page. In our plan, we define 5 types of human-panther interactions, ranging from simple sighting to an encounter. These are pretty benign. It goes up to a threat and attack, which obviously are more serious. We treat depredation separately because no humans are involved in that type of interaction. And we see eating animals as a totally natural behavior and not one that should be punished. So just again, this is an interagency response team. It's made of biologists, law enforcement, and public information folks from both FWC, US Fish and Wildlife, and the National Park Service. So if there ever is an interaction that requires a response, the team meets to discuss the details and develops an action plan. So the serious interactions are quite rare. In fact, we've never had a verified human attack. Depredations, on the other hand, are quite frequent. And the vast majority of these involve hobby or backyard livestock. As you can see, about 10 years after genetic restoration, so in 2005, we started seeing panthers start to infiltrate the suburbs and the depredation rates generally increased until about 2018 when we had more than 45 reports. We've had canvassing events and held town hall meetings to educate people on living with panthers. But the single most effective thing to prevent depredations is to pen the animals at night in a predator-proof pen. And so that's our main message when we investigate depredation events. And we also partner with NGOs here. The Conservancy of Southwest Florida offers a compensation program for hobby livestock, and Defenders of Wildlife offers cost sharing in building the pens. Of course, road kills are also a concern. We average about 24 road kills each year. Each one is collected and we perform a full necropsy, and we're able to get quite a bit of data on these individuals. So while we don't want there to be any road kills, it is one of the ways that we really learn a lot about panther health. The best way to prevent road kills is the installation of wildlife crossings. So these underpasses protect wildlife, but also people too, by preventing collisions. And of course, they benefit many other species. We have to say that Florida has done an excellent job of installing underpasses. So some of the first ones to go in for panthers specifically were when Alligator Alley was converted into Interstate 75. 36 underpasses were installed. And since then, underpasses have been installed in other hot spots where panther road kills have occurred. And so this is an example of a radio-collared male panther who used 8 wildlife crossings within 2 months. You can see as he's crossing I-75, going from north to south, and then along County Road 29, sorry, State Route 29. The biggest issue facing panthers today is habitat loss and degradation. You know, it's across the state. Urbanization is relentless, and we get plenty of commenting assignments, and we can only attempt to mitigate the development. We don't have any authority to stop a project, but we sometimes can affect how the developments are designed. So for example, in this, this is an old project, but we suggested an underpass go along a stretch of road that cut through a preserve area. And then of course, a lot of these apartment communities and housing communities have water retention areas, and the developers always want to make those water ponds in a central part of the development, sort of a landscape feature. But we suggest that the water structures go on the outside of the community to act as a buffer between the residential area and the wildlife. So on a project by project basis, we can't really slow the trend of development. But of course, at the state level, Florida Forever is a great program for acquiring lands for protection. I'm sure you guys are all aware. So far, the state has purchased almost 900,000 acres. And FWC is involved in securing opportunity areas in the Florida Wildlife Corridor. This isn't something that I'm directly involved in. It's more our private lands group and the land acquisition group. They're working with private landowners to secure either easements or sales. So switching gears to a relatively new disease. I'm sure you've all heard of it. Feline leukomyelopathy, or FLM. It's pretty much our main priority at the moment. So the condition first showed up in 2017, and it's an upper neuron disease that causes lesions on the spinal cord, and that results in hind limb weakness and incoordination. It affects panthers and bobcats. From what we've seen, we have not observed it in any other species, house cats included. The thing is that it doesn't really show, any of the tests that we run, we are having issues finding a cause. We've really checked for everything. It is more prevalent in kittens. It seems to show up, at least, on video, when they're around 4 to 5 months old. It seems to come on suddenly. And as far as we can tell, it doesn't really progress or get better. We have ruled out some things. It doesn't seem to be genetically related. We haven't found any infection agents. And then things like cane toads and red tide and blue-green algae, all of the hot button topics in our environment, they don't seem to be related either. And so this is what it looks like. You'll see the first kitten doesn't seem too incredibly affected, but the next kitten is severely affected. And so that's another perplexing thing, is that you have multiple kittens in a litter and they're affected in different ways. So it's not just a southwestern Florida disease. It has been observed throughout the state, as I said, in bobcats. But of course, it is in higher concentrations in this part of the state. So far, we've documented 58 cases, 24 panthers and 34 bobcats. And so the only way we can conclusively verify that an animal has it is at necropsy, by seeing the lesions on the spinal cord. So all of the probable cases are based on the video evidence that's submitted to us. We do think it is some sort of toxin, but whether it's natural or man-made, we don't know. It has to be something relatively common for this to have been seen across the state. Something that would make felids especially susceptible, especially developing young. Is it something that's exposure in utero or during lactation? We have looked at nutritional deficiencies, but really nothing pops up. So we are continuing work on, trying to figure out the etymology of this disease. We are expanding our camera trap monitoring network so that we can determine the prevalence and figure out whether it's ongoing or whether it dies down. We're also collaring bobcats now so that they can sort of act as a surrogate to panthers being more common. Ideally, we have a female bobcat who dens, and we can monitor her kittens from birth until maybe disease onset. So that's really one of our focuses right now. So recall that the population status is 120 to 230 adults and subadults. And for the past few years, the trend in population growth has tracked with the trend in roadkills and depredations. But both roadkills and depredations reached a peak in like 2007, 17, 18, which is coincidentally when FLM showed up. So does that mean that there has been a concurrent decline in the population? We don't quite have enough data to draw that correlation yet, but the research folks are working on developing new population estimates. So you know that panthers are restricted to the southern half of the state. The shaded counties here on the map indicate where panthers have been documented. The line in yellow indicates the Caloosahatchee River. And it's only males that have been north of the river. And one male made it up to Georgia back in 2008, where he was shot by a deer hunter. So until fairly recently, we have struggled with how do we get females north of the river. Then in 2016, we made the exciting discovery on camera and a track, documenting a female. And this was the first female observation north of the river in over 40 years. And since then, 3 other females have been documented. I believe 3 litters of kittens were also observed. Unfortunately, we have no evidence that any of those kittens survived to dispersal age. So here's that map again, showing the dark green shaded counties where male panthers have been observed. The cluster of blue are all telemetry points and observations of female panthers. And the pink stars are the outliers, the females that have been seen aside from the cluster or north of the river. So these sightings were all in like 2016, 17, and 18. And then there was nothing, no more activity on camera until, unfortunately, April and May of this year, where we had 2 roadkills north of the river and both were female. And it was even more unfortunate that one of the females was pregnant. So although it gives us a bit of hope that there was a reproductive female north of the river, it's too soon to declare that the breeding range has expanded. So just as there are opportunity areas for the wildlife corridor, there are opportunities for panther expansion if we can increase tolerance and appreciation for panthers. And that is another of our new focus. So cattle ranching is prevalent in Central Florida, and the livestock indemnity program makes it difficult for a commercial rancher to be compensated if they lose a calf to a panther. And if they bother with the bureaucracy and the paperwork, it really isn't worth the payout that they get. I believe it's something like 75% of the market value. Additionally, especially if it's a ranch north of the river, a panther caches their kill. And so it's difficult to prove that a missing calf is due to a panther. But hopefully we can improve the situation. In October of this year, the FWC will be receiving Section 6 funding from U.S. Fish and Wildlife for a pilot program that will offer depredation payments to folks at market price. And hopefully our program will be less cumbersome than the Farm Bill program. We are also piloting a payment for ecosystem services program for folks who commit to providing, maintaining, or improving suitable habitat. And we're envisioning this as sort of a tiered payment. So the lowest amount might go to folks who have suitable habitat or that are working to improve it. And if they document panther occupancy, that could be the next tier. And if they host a panther den, then that would be the highest payment. So we're going to be advertising for and hiring a biologist to manage this program. And that person will also be conducting technical assistance programs with these private landowners to offer some minimization measures to hopefully prevent depredations from occurring. And so this is some from previous research that evaluated the need for a payment for ecosystem program. And it just sort of illustrates the fact that most landowners recognize that panthers have a right to exist, but they still feel strongly about the right to protect themselves and their calves. So it's how do we get them to welcome the panther, to see value in the panther. So the species status assessment came out last year, and this did create a bit of confusion on what it meant for Florida panthers. There's verbiage that recognizes the taxonomic status may not be warranted because the current scientifically accepted taxonomy and nomenclature essentially recognizing that they are very similar to cougars out west. But the species status assessment is not a decision-making document. It's essentially a biological risk assessment and a compilation of the best available scientific information on panthers today. We don't know whether the federal government will change the panther status, but regardless of what happens, they will remain protected by the state. And so with that, I will leave you with a video from the F-Stop Foundation of one of our females, collared females, and two of her kittens. The kittens are also wearing collars, but unfortunately the batteries died prematurely. So we continue to monitor them on camera.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was an excellent presentation. And I've been in the environmental field for 35 years. And I always, really, truly, always appreciate a presentation where I learn something. And I learned a lot here. So I want to thank you very much for that. And hopefully the program moves forward well, and the Panthers expand. There are a lot of challenges out there, but it takes a whole team of folks to do it. The environmental folks are passionate about it. And I know the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission is passionate about it. Now, if we just could get everybody else understanding what needs to be done, that would be great. So again, thank you very much.